What I wanted to offer this morning was a bit of a perspective of what I think the barriers to change are in this industry in terms of delivering more energy efficient spaces, more comfortable spaces, and then moving into this whole cycle of how we're going to improve soft landings, which for me is multi-dimensional. Worth saying just as well quickly that I think it's fascinating to me that at the same time this presentation is going on, there's another one in another theatre about the well building standard. And I don't think until the world realises that the two things are tightly aligned that we're ever going to move forward. So we sit here and we end up talking about energy savings, which to most company CEOs are just expected now. If you can offer productivity savings or health impacts on their staff, you're actually starting to move into a very interesting area, which may give you a bit of a clue about what I'm thinking about. But I thought what I'd start with, and it's not to be difficult, I don't think there's anything new here, but just to articulate what I think the reasons for new approaches to maintenance. There's a lot of focus on design, a lot of very, very intelligent people, a lot of very, very good models get made at the design point. And as I think someone touched on earlier on, sometimes it'll be 2 or 3 years after the building's designed that the building's occupied, and the person it was built for has changed. And the world has changed, the technology has changed. So actually having a building that is fit for the purpose when it comes to being in life is really hard. So actually I think something that Arup have always said, continuous commissioning for me is the key. But that doesn't help if you've got a very old-fashioned maintenance industry that only want to work to SFG 20. And I think you touched on it as well, Steve, or Mark, the SIBC. I am fed up for the many, many years I was in maintenance of us pulling out the SIBC manufacturer's code effectively for when you need to replace an asset, which may be up and down slightly based on condition, but didn't really take into account run times, didn't take into account what the building's been used for. It was very much black and white and scared the living daylights out of finance directors because it opened the wallet. Let's be frank about it, it was a good tool for a lot of maintenance providers to not only encourage investment in the right way, to encourage investment in their buildings, but also as a way to generate additional works on buildings, which I think is the wrong profit motive. And I think those two things combined, SFG 20 and SIBC, gives you a one-size-fits-all, risk-free approach to maintenance. And I think that you've got to remember that's where that started. Let's have a standard of maintenance that gets rid of the cowboys, that allows us then to have some confidence that we're delivering a risk-free environment, which is great. But risk-free environments are not always the most innovative. So we've talked about the design intent into operational reality, and then this reactive expenditure piece just blows my mind. And again, Mark's touched on it. None of this is new in anybody's slides, but I'm trying to put it together from a landlord perspective. If you look at an average service charge budget, it can be somewhere between 70 and 80% reactive maintenance. And normally a variable in the service charge you can actually do anything with is maintenance and energy. So those are the two areas that I think need the most focus in terms of proving to tenants and occupiers that they're getting value from the office they're sitting in. And I think that's the opportunity we've got as an industry, is that we need to turn this on its head and stop thinking about it as the inputs from an engineering perspective and start thinking about that this is a great place to work, or a hospital is there to cure people, or whatever it might be, a factory is there to build things, and start engineering the solution, the retro-engineering the solution, back away from the reason people are there. And the huge opportunity for me of that is offices. Because at the moment we put people blindly into offices, 20, 30 years old, high levels of CO2, poor ventilation, high levels of humidity, which is transferring germs around the floors. And we just, because we don't measure it, because we're not accountable for it as an industry, we don't change. So I guess if in 4 points, that's my call to action, if you like. And I'm going to reuse an analogy which I think was really nice from Steve, just to show that we're all on the same wavelength in some ways. At the moment, the way we run buildings is very much how I deal with my car. When it goes wrong, I pop the engine hood up and I have a look at it and think this is well beyond my capabilities, and phone the garage. So that's a reactive approach, if you like. I think the middle ground is now, if a lot of these cars, as you said earlier, will tell you when they need a service or when something needs replacing, which is great. I don't think we're there yet in buildings, and that's what I've said tomorrow. That's the scary bit. We've got all these building management systems, but normally the only person that understands them is a BMS engineer. The on-site engineers, the FM, the client hasn't got any view of how to get that information out and use it in a way that isn't ultra-technical. But I think the aspiration should be this predictive modelling piece, and I think it's got to be real time, right? It's got to be rules based. It's got to be, how do I want to run that building? How do I want to run that space? And it's got to trigger alerts and alarms into the relevant people that can make a decision. And that won't always be an engineer. Sometimes something needs investing in. Sometimes there's a human change element, i.e. in our world, too many people in a space. So is it safe to have that many people in the space, not just from a fire regulations point of view, but from a productivity point of view? And those are the conversations in industry we've been really worried to have. And I think the F1 industry is fascinating. If you've spent any time in it, I was lucky enough to work with Red Bull Racing when I was at Mighty. And they all know what their job is. They all know what the purpose of the organisation is. And they all know if they don't do X, Y, and Z in the right order or in the right time, has an impact on 400 other people. In most of our organisations, we don't have those sort of conversations with clients. We're very focused on the granular detail of a pump or a temperature sensor or a CO2 sensor. And as an industry, if we're going to get to that future world, the data's got to mean something to someone. There's no good, and I think, again, the airport analogy is really good. I like that. The airplane analogy is really good. Is if you or I walked into that cockpit, we wouldn't have a clue. But the pilot knows and the engineer knows, but that's great. But as the person travelling on the plane, I just need to have the trust in the pilot to get me from A to B. And one of the things I was thinking while you were talking actually was, I think what we've got in our buildings at the moment is this situation where we want everyone's opinion on how the building should run. Is it too hot, too cold, being the bane of everyone's life in maintenance? But that can't be right. If we all walked on a plane and had an opinion about what altitude to fly at or how much fuel we needed and which airport we were going to land on, it'd be absolute chaos. And I think, in the simple answer to your question, Steve, that's probably our problem here, is we need to do some education around why we've got the building, why we've got the space, the age of the equipment, the rent you're paying in relation to the quality of the asset, which may be a reason why it's a real bugger to heat. Do you see what I mean? So all these conversations, which for me hinge at why you've got the space, then come into asset life, energy savings, and ultimately human health and productivity. So what are we doing about LNG? Just to finish that off, I think there's 3 layers. If you know me, there's always 3, but I think it's quite an easy way to explain it. We've got the building data itself. We've got the occupier. God forbid we actually talk about the people that use the buildings. And then we've got this concept of the digital asset, which in a nutshell is really what you guys have been talking about, which is analytics, it's modelling. But what I wanted to try and demonstrate, and this is how I've used this internally to talk to the legal and general board, if you like, around how we're going to change, is how do we build that knowledge to give ourselves a better return of investment, which is ultimately, as a pension fund investor, what we need to do is need to demonstrate we're getting the right yield from these buildings, but also that we can tie that up with the occupier experience so they renew their leases, so they choose LNG space over all other landlords. And I think it's reasonably simple in theory. I think the practicalities are a challenge. But ultimately for me, there's data we are not collecting and there's data we don't understand, would be my summary there. So at the moment, service delivery data, which would normally sit in a CAFM system, is very rarely surfaced to anybody for anything other than statutory compliance, especially from a landlord perspective. We've got loads of energy and BMS data. I mean, there is so much data in buildings, and especially from a landlord perspective, a BMS business case is reasonably easy. Central St Giles has been a good example. People understand why you need that, but then they just think the technical world will use that data and do the right things. Not always true. And then health and well-being data. So I've touched on this already, but I'm absolutely clear, if we just looked at 5 measurables in a building, regardless of whether or not there's a BMS there, we would change the way we maintain it. Those being light, air quality, noise, humidity, temperature. Those 5 with a bit of motion thrown in just to make sure there's people in the space. I think those are the key performance indicators our industry needs, because everyone understands that. That's the equivalent in the cockpit scenario of understanding where you're flying to, what height you need to be at, and what impact you've got on that plane in terms of your personal health. So you're safe, right? In a building, if we started to talking to people around those 5 parameters and we educate occupiers around that in terms of how they can get the best out of that space, I think we'll see a dramatic change in the way we then use energy and BMS data to support that argument. So our occupier then gets involved because they're now educated around building performance. So instead of just giving them a help desk number to call and hoping for the best over the next 12 months, we're actually saying this is how the building should be formed based on the level of equipment we've got in the building and the service levels you have bought with us through your rent or your service charge contribution. And then we're going to survey them. And we're not going to leave it to our managing agents anymore. We're going to survey them as legal and general and say, right, is our building performing in line with our expectations? Bearing in mind we've already aligned those expectations to what they're paying, where they are, the age of the building. So then we can take all of those things we just talked about and start modelling that for comfort policies to say, right, okay, floor 3 in this building in Bristol is a call centre. Therefore, it's far more important for them that we have a real control over ventilation, because poor air quality is going to make people feel drowsy, they're not going to be able to do their job particularly well, and as a result, their business is not going to be able to perform as well as it might do in a different environment. Versus the law firm on floor 6, who might need a slightly different set of comfort policies to drive their business. Now, all of those comfort policies can be designed with energy and asset life in mind, but my view is you need to start at that point, because that's the language that everybody understands. Then we can model it, then we can predict it, and then ultimately we can then target the investment around that asset, because we all understand what we're getting from it, and actually that relationship is much stronger with the occupier. And then the holy grail of FM, just to give it a plug at the end, is proactive response. Why should somebody have to call a help desk in 2000 and what are we now, 19, to say I'm too hot or too cold? Right? First of all, I don't know if that's true. You might have gone for a run, as someone very eloquently said, which is often a case, or you might have some personal health issues, which mean you might feel the cold or the hot more than that. If we have an education layer, which we talked about right at the front end in terms of why that space is set up as it is, then it becomes much easier to set rules and alerts into the FM business to respond when things are actually wrong, than waiting for someone to pick up the phone to say, the light's gone, I'm too hot, too cold, something doesn't feel right, which when you look at help desk data is actually where we are. So for me, this is what we call in the knowledge cell. This is absolutely critical to what we're doing. So forget soft landings, forget all that stuff. This is a continuous approach to managing not just our occupiers, but our assets going forward, taking into account all the technology, all the stuff these guys have talked about, and applying it in a real-time format.